The first lie didn't sound like a lie at all. It sounded like a promise of progress, a lullaby of change. Hidden in the shadows of the old community hall, barely breathing, Elijah Vance was supposed to be witnessing a new dawn for his people. Instead, he heard the true voice of power, a chilling promise that shattered everything he believed about justice and equality. In that cramped darkness, his heart pounding against the cold, forgotten history of his ancestors, he realized the truth was far bigger than a broken trust. This wasn't just about another land deal, it was about systemic control, the insidious manipulation of a community's future, a plan that had been unfolding right in front of them while they trusted blindly in the system. What he witnessed that night would force him to choose, expose the truth and ignite a revolution, or let his people be silenced forever. Before we dive deeper into Elijah's journey, tell us in the comments, what systemic injustice has impacted your community? And don't forget to subscribe for more stories of resilience, empowerment, and the fight for justice. The night he decided to hide in the shadows, Elijah Vance told himself it was an act of profound love for his people. He stood alone in the dim, forgotten corner of the old community center, the air thick with the dust of generations, listening to the echo of his own desperate hope. He had rehearsed this moment a dozen times. He would gather evidence, expose the lies, and ignite a movement. Their community needed that kind of fight now, or so he believed. For months, something had been off. Not open hostility or dramatic confrontations. Those would have been easier to face. Instead, it was the chilling silence from City Hall, the short, dismissive answers, the forced smiles of officials arriving half a second too late. They guarded their plans like state secrets. When Elijah's group pressed for answers, they were met with vague assurances, always distracted. Still, he blamed himself. He always did. Elijah was the kind of man who believed that if his community was breaking, it meant they hadn't fought hard enough, hadn't spoken loud enough. The old janitor's closet door creaked softly as he slipped inside, the air thick with the scent of forgotten history. He folded himself low behind stacked boxes, a ghost in the machine. His heart raced, feeling both foolish and fiercely hopeful. The council's public statement from earlier echoed in his mind, minor delays, don't worry. That had been the final, chilling push. Minutes passed. The building hummed with the distant drone of city life. Then, the heavy oak doors of the meeting room swung open, and Councilwoman Thorne swept in. Elijah held his breath as the doors closed, and then her voice, not addressing the public, not on record. She was on a private call, her voice amplified by the room's acoustics. I told you tonight is fine, she said softly to softly, the tone she used when she didn't want the real conversation overheard. Elijah's chest tightened. A man's voice, calm and familiar in a way that made Elijah's stomach drop, responded through the speakerphone. You sure the community won't notice? She laughed, not the polite, public laugh she gave constituents. Not the restrained smile she showed Elijah's activist group lately. This laugh was warm, intimate, dripping with contempt. They never notice anything, she purred. That's why this works. The words hit harder than any shouted insult could have. Elijah pressed his palm against his mouth, stifling a gasp. His heart slammed so violently, he was sure she could hear it through the thin wall. The unfairness of it burned. Years of community organizing, of pleading, of shrinking their dreams to fit her vision, while she spoke about his people like an inconvenience, an obstacle to her grand design. The meeting continued, each sentence peeling away another layer of the progress Elijah thought he knew. Just be careful, the man's voice cautioned. Timing matters, it always does, she replied, a predatory gleam in her eye. I've thought this through. Thought what through? Elijah's mind raced, trying to catch up. This wasn't a careless oversight. There was no guilt in her voice, no fear, only chilling confidence, meticulous planning. She outlined the next steps, and with each detail, Elijah's hope for genuine collaboration collapsed further. This wasn't about community uplift, it was about displacement, gentrification, erasure. The injustice of it all settled deep in his chest. He had trusted her, defended her when elders hinted something felt wrong. Told himself advocacy meant patience, not suspicion. Now he was trapped in the shadows of his own community's fate, Listening to its future unravel in real time, the meeting concluded. Through a crack in the closet door, Elijah saw her straighten her tailored suit, smooth her public facade. The same practiced movements she used before addressing the media. "I'll call you after," she said into the phone. "Don't worry, everything's under control." The call ended. Elijah's vision blurred. Control. That word echoed louder than any protest chant ever had. He wanted to burst out, confront her, demand explanations, but something colder, sharper took hold instead. Instinct. If he revealed himself now, he would only see what she allowed him to see. Feigned concern, empty promises, half-truths. So he stayed hidden. She swept out of the room, her heels clicking against the polished floor. The heavy doors closed. Her footsteps faded. Silence rushed back in, thick and suffocating. But now it was a silence filled with purpose. Elijah sat there long after, shaking, replaying every moment of the past year with new eyes. The delayed permits, the sudden policy changes, the way she had started dismissing his community's concerns in public, like she was already rehearsing a future where their voices didn't matter. This wasn't just betrayal. This was a calculated strategy of systemic oppression. And somewhere in that suffocating silence, between profound heartbreak for his people and burning clarity, Elijah understood one terrifying truth. Whatever Councilwoman Thorne was planning, his community was never meant to find out like this. But now that he had, there was no going back. The fight for their dignity had just begun. If you want to follow this journey to its end, make sure you're subscribed. Through betrayal, truth, and what comes after, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Elijah stood frozen, the words echoing in the hushed chamber, each syllable a hammer blow. When he finally moved, his legs felt like lead. The grand hall now a hollow tomb of broken promises. The air outside was sharp, biting, as if the very night was trying to shake him awake. He stood there for a long moment, staring at the official decree that no longer felt like a promise of progress, but a meticulously crafted weapon aimed directly at his community. He didn't confront the council when they returned to their offices. He didn't call. He didn't protest. That quiet restraint surprised even him. Instead, he walked home, the weight of generations on his shoulders, and lay awake in his bed, listening to the ticking of the old clock, replaying every condescending word he had heard. Their dismissive laughter, the casual cruelty of, "They'll never see it coming." It wasn't just the deceit. It was the audacious belief that his people, his community, were too blind, too insignificant to challenge their rewritten history. In their minds, he was someone small, someone safe to deceive, and that was what hurt the most. By morning, something inside Elijah had shifted. The shock had calcified into an unyielding clarity. If they believed his community was asleep, he would let them dream their false dream, but only for a little while longer. He started paying attention in ways he never had before, not out of obsession, but precision. The way the official documents were subtly rephrased, the sudden changes in zoning laws, the new development plans that arrived at the city hall, not the community center. He noticed dates, times, patterns. At the next public forum, the lead councilwoman smiled, her voice smooth. "Busy week, Elijah, don't worry your head." He nodded, matching her calm. Though his chest burned with the effort, "Take care," he replied, the unfairness of it making his hands tremble. When she turned away, she was building a gleaming facade of progress, expecting his community to applaud, while systematically erasing their heritage, their rights, their very future from the blueprints. That afternoon, Elijah took a day off from his work, for the first time in years, not to rest, but to think. He spread documents across his kitchen table, old land deeds, historical records, community meeting minutes, things he had once trusted implicitly. As he read, small irregularities began to surface, policies adjusted, beneficiaries changed, decisions made quietly, efficiently. The story deepened. What terrified him wasn't just the betrayal. It was the cold calculation behind it. This wasn't impulse. This was generations of systemic preparation. Over the next week, Elijah became invisible in his own community. He listened more than he spoke, asked fewer questions. He let them believe their performance was flawless. Meanwhile, He documented everything: dates, testimonies, screenshots of public records they thought were hidden. Each discovery carved away another piece of the false narrative they had woven around his people. One evening, while the council celebrated a new victory, a message buzzed on Elijah's old phone. He didn't touch it. He didn't need to. The name flashed across the screen, familiar now, attached to the voice from the hushed chamber. A name he would never forget. The realization settled heavy in his gut. The man wasn't a stranger. He was someone from their own community. Someone who had sat at their tables, laughed at their jokes, looked Elijah in the eye. The betrayal had roots, deep and insidious. That night, Elijah sat alone on his porch long after the city lights dimmed. Rage surged, then a profound grief for what was lost, but from the ashes rose something unshakable: resolve. He wasn't seeking a riot or dramatic scenes. Those would only give them control back. What he wanted was truth, clean, undeniable, and justice that would echo through generations. Days later, an unexpected message arrived, anonymous, short: "Be careful. Not everything is what it seems." Elijah stared at the screen, his pulse quickening. For the first time since that devastating meeting, fear returned, not the fear of losing, but of what they might be capable of. Someone else knew. Someone else was watching. The mystery widened. He realized then that he wasn't just uncovering a single act of injustice. He was stepping into a web of decisions that had been forming long before he heard those words: decisions that could cost his community far more than land or resources if he made the wrong move. So he slowed down. He sought quiet advice without revealing too much. Old connections, professional opinions framed as hypotheticals. Each conversation confirmed the same unsettling truth. If he acted emotionally, his people would lose. If he acted strategically, with dignity and unity, they might survive this intact. At community gatherings, the council continued their performance. Gentle questions, casual affection, plans for the future, spoken just convincingly enough to feel real. Watching them now felt like watching an actor rehearse a role he already knew the ending to, and yet, beneath the anger, a strange sadness lingered. He mourned the man he had been, the one who trusted easily, who believed justice was enough to protect them. That man was gone now. In his place stood someone quieter, sharper, awake. Elijah didn't know how this would end. He only knew it wouldn't end with his people in the dark anymore. Because once you witness the truth of your own oppression, once you see the chains they tried to hide, you can never unsee it. And you will never let them hide it again. The message haunted him for days: be careful. Not everything is what it seems. Elijah read it over and over, searching for tone where none existed. No threat, no explanation. Just a warning that felt heavier than any accusation. He deleted it, then recovered it, then locked it away in a folder he pretended didn't exist. Whoever had sent it knew something, and that meant Elijah was not alone. The fight for justice had just begun. The whispers began subtly, like a chill wind through the historic streets of Freedom Heights. Aisha felt it, a growing unease, a sense that something vital was being taken, piece by piece. She noticed the glossy brochures appearing, promising renewal, but her eyes saw the predatory gleam behind the smiles of the Prosperity Holdings representatives. At night, she lay awake, the weight of her ancestors' struggle pressing down, wondering how a community so rich in spirit could be so easily dismissed. One sweltering afternoon, a new flyer appeared, announcing a community revitalization initiative, a work of art and deception. For your benefit, it proclaimed, but Aisha saw the thinly veiled threat. It's important. A company rep echoed, relief flickering across his face as he thought she bought the lie. The falsehood hung heavy in the humid air. That day, Aisha made a silent vow. She wouldn't confront them with anger, not yet. That was what they expected, a predictable outburst they could easily dismiss. Instead, she would follow the invisible trails, the digital breadcrumbs, the forgotten paper records, the quiet footprints of systemic erasure. The next morning, before dawn, Aisha drove to the city archives, a place rarely visited by anyone under 70. She had found a reference, buried deep in an old community newsletter her grandmother had kept. The clerk, a man with tired eyes, barely looked up as she signed in. assuming she was just another student on a forgotten assignment. Inside the musty archives, the air smelled of aged paper and forgotten stories. Aisha's hands trembled as she pulled out the heavy ledgers. What she found wasn't a love letter, no grand gesture of community support, just documents, zoning maps, land deeds, environmental impact assessments, neatly labeled by year. The names of Freedom Heights residents appeared less and less as the decades progressed. A cold understanding settled over her. This wasn't about developing the community. It was about dissolving it, cleanly, legally, without mess. The community engagement events, the glossy brochures, they weren't solutions, they were leverage, a distraction, something to keep the residents emotionally invested in a false hope, while Prosperity Holdings prepared an exit that would leave Freedom Heights with nothing but broken promises. The sheer injustice of it all made her dizzy. She sat on the cold concrete floor, head in her hands, feeling something crack open inside her. Not anger, not yet. It was grief, the kind that comes when you realize the promise of equality, the dream of a fair chance, never existed the way you believed. When she returned home, the vibrant murals on the walls of Freedom Heights felt unfamiliar, like a set built to resemble a life that was already being dismantled. That evening, her phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. "You found the old records, didn't you?" Aisha froze. Her fingers hovered over the screen. This wasn't coincidence. This was surveillance. Someone had been watching her moves. The message wasn't mocking. It was calm, observant. "I don't want to hurt you," the next text read, "but you need to understand who you're dealing with." Aisha's heart pounded as she typed back for the first time. "Who is this?" Several minutes passed. "Someone who almost made the same mistake you did." The implication hit hard. She wasn't the first to fight. Maybe not even the 10th. Aisha leaned back against the kitchen counter, mind racing. Whoever this was, they weren't aligned with Prosperity Holdings, or at least not anymore. That made them dangerous, or invaluable. "Why warn me?" she typed. The reply came slower this time, "Because if you confront them without irrefutable proof, you lose, and if you wait too long, you might lose more than just your homes." Aisha stared at the words until they blurred. The story was expanding again, stretching beyond what she could control. She felt like a character who had stumbled into the wrong film, one where the rules were harsher, the consequences permanent. She didn't respond again. Instead, she focused on what she could do. She made digital copies of everything from the archives, stored them off-site. She consulted a pro bono lawyer, under the guise of a community project, learning just how vulnerable her people were and how carefully she would need to move. When Prosperity Holdings held their next community outreach event, they brought gifts, branded merchandise, a forced smile, stories that sounded rehearsed. "You didn't have to," Aisha said, accepting a pen, feeling the irony settle heavy against her pulse. "We wanted to," the representative replied, watching her reaction closely. For a moment, their eyes locked. Something flickered there, suspicion, perhaps, or fear. Aisha couldn't tell. That night, as she walked through Freedom Heights, a neighbor reached for her hand. Aisha let her. Her grip was warm, familiar, almost convincing of solidarity. But Aisha knew now that every interaction, every promise, was part of a narrative they controlled, and control was the one thing she was quietly taking back. She no longer wanted answers shouted across a room. She wanted the truth, revealed at the exact moment it would matter most. Because if Prosperity Holdings believed they were orchestrating the ending, they were wrong. Aisha was still in the story, and she was done being the woman in the back seat. Aisha began to live in layers. On the surface, she was the same quiet, observant community member she had always been, predictable, cooperative, quietly attentive. She asked about the development. She nodded at the right moments. She didn't question their late-night meetings or sudden policy shifts. She let them believe her silence was proof they still owned her. Beneath that surface, something colder moved with purpose. She stopped sleeping deeply. Every night became a planning session in the dark, her mind replaying conversations, mapping timelines, testing outcomes. She realized how easily her community had once trusted, shared routines, how dangerous familiarity could be when weaponized by those who knew their hopes intimately. One evening, Prosperity Holdings casually mentioned a temporary relocation of a few families. "It's just for a short while," they said. Senator Thorne swirled the crystal water in her glass, a practiced, elegant gesture. Elijah felt a cold dread, but his face remained a mask of calm. "If you think it's best," she purred, her gaze lingering a second too long. "You trust me, don't you, Elijah?" The question wasn't emotional, it was a trap. "Of course," he said, the word tasting like ash. That night, he checked the community fund account. The transaction had already gone through. His digital signature, replicated with chilling precision, sat beneath hers, legal, clean, irreversible. The Willow Creek land deal was done. That was when Elijah finally understood the full scale of the injustice. She wasn't acting impulsively. She was systematically dismantling their community, piece by piece, confident they wouldn't notice until it was too late. The next message from the anonymous contact arrived 2 days later. "The evictions are accelerating. No greeting. No explanation." Elijah typed back. "How do you know?" The reply came almost immediately. "Because she always does when she feels watched." A chill ran through him. "Who are you?" This time, the answer was longer. "I was her chief of staff years ago. Saw what she was doing to the neighboring districts. I lost everything after I asked the wrong questions. By the time I realized what was happening, the narrative was already written, and I was the villain in it." Elijah read the message 3 times. Pieces clicked into place. Community meetings where concerns were dismissed, official reports that never quite lined up. The way Senator Thorne spoke about progress and development. "Why help me now?" Elijah asked. There was a pause before the reply came. "Because someone should have warned us." From that point on, the messages became less frequent, but more precise. Subtle confirmations, gentle corrections when Elijah assumed too much. Marcus, the anonymous contact, never told him what to do, only what not to underestimate. Meanwhile, the atmosphere in Willow Creek grew tighter. Senator Thorne became more visible, more attentive to the media. It was the kind of attention that arrived too late, like flowers sent after a funeral. She suggested new community initiatives, spoke about revitalization, about starting fresh. Elijah played along, feeling the weight of each lie settle between them like an invisible wall. One night, she announced a new community resettlement plan. "Just to be responsible," she said, brushing off concerns, "for the good of the community. You never know." Elijah watched her on the news, the calm certainty in her eyes, the assumption that they would agree. "That makes sense," he murmured to himself. Inside, something snapped into place. That was the moment he stopped reacting and started preparing the reveal. He didn't rush. He waited. Let her move first. Let her believe she was ahead. He gathered every document, every message, every digital trace that told the real story of Willow Creek's exploitation. He made backups of backups, shared nothing with anyone who could be traced back to him. And slowly, quietly, he arranged the timing. The opportunity came sooner than expected. A televised public hearing on the future of Willow Creek. Important officials, community leaders, legal witnesses disguised as concerned citizens. A setting she had chosen herself, believing it would showcase the life she was about to orchestrate for the community. She wore a power suit that night, confident, radiant, seemingly untouchable. Elijah watched her greet guests with practiced warmth, her hand resting lightly on his arm for the cameras, like a prop. When she leaned close and whispered, "Everything's perfect," he almost smiled. Almost. As the evening unfolded, Elijah felt strangely calm. The fear that had once consumed him was gone, replaced by clarity. Whatever happened next, the truth would no longer belong only to her. At the exact moment she stood to toast to new beginnings for Willow Creek, Elijah stood as well. There was a flicker of surprise on her face, then irritation. This wasn't in her script. He spoke evenly, not loudly. He didn't need to. "I think before we talk about the future," he said, "there are a few things that deserve daylight." The room stilled. He didn't look at her. He looked at the people she had counted on to validate her story. Then he began, methodically, calmly, without accusation. Just facts, timelines, documents projected behind him, her plans for Willow Creek unfolding in cold, undeniable detail. Gasps rippled through the room. Whispers followed. Her face drained of color. For the first time, she looked at him, not as something she owned, but as a variable she had profoundly miscalculated. Elijah met her gaze then, not with anger, not with triumph, with finality. The ending she had designed for Willow Creek collapsed in real time, exposed by the one person she thought would never see it coming. And as the room erupted into a cacophony of murmurs and shouts, Elijah felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Freedom. The room didn't explode the way Elijah had imagined. It fractured. At first, there was silence, the kind that presses against your ears until you're painfully aware of your own breathing. Then the murmurs began, spreading like cracks in glass. Chairs shifted. Someone dropped a pen. A woman near the window covered her mouth, eyes fixed on the screen. Where documents still glowed in merciless clarity, Senator Thorne stood frozen, one hand gripping the edge of the podium, as if the floor beneath her had tilted. Her confidence hadn't vanished all at once. It peeled away in layers, first disbelief, then calculation, then raw fear. She laughed softly, too softly. "This is ridiculous," she said, voice tight. "You're taking things out of context." Elijah didn't respond. He had learned that silence, when earned, was louder than argument. One of the officials, a man Elijah barely knew, but who had signed more legislative bills than Elijah ever would, cleared his throat. "These documents are these verified?" Elijah nodded, independently. Multiple times. Seraphina Thorne's carefully constructed composure fractured. Another voice, laced with disbelief, cut through the stunned silence. "Why would you expose this? Why not just let it be?" That question, heavy with the weight of complicity, seemed to strike deeper than any evidence. Elijah Vance watched her jaw clench, watched her eyes dart desperately round the room, searching for a sympathetic face, for someone to salvage her crumbling narrative. No one moved. Her gaze finally locked onto Elijah, eyes burning with a raw, venomous hatred. "You betrayed me," she hissed, the words a desperate claw at her lost power. "You orchestrated this." Elijah finally spoke, his voice steady. "No," he said quietly, the single word a hammer blow of truth. "You did." The words landed with surgical precision. Not dramatic, not cruel, just undeniably true. The rest of the evening dissolved into fragments. People left early, their faces a canvas of shock and dawning understanding. Conversations splintered into hushed whispers. Phones emerged, messages flew. The fortress of influence Seraphina had so meticulously built began to erode under the relentless scrutiny of truth. When they were finally alone, the silence felt different, emptier, colder, a void where her grand pronouncements once echoed. She sank into a chair, staring blankly ahead. "You think this makes you a hero?" Elijah stood across from her, the exhaustion of years of quiet struggle finally catching up. "I think it makes me free," he replied. She scoffed, but the sound was hollow, devoid of its usual cutting edge. "You have no idea what you've unleashed." He considered that. "I know exactly what I've unleashed." I stopped pretending. Her shoulders slumped. The performance was over. In the days that followed, the consequences arrived swiftly and decisively. Funding for her initiatives was frozen pending investigation. Partnerships were suspended. People who once returned her calls instantly now took days, or didn't respond at all. The narrative of progress and unity she had so confidently spun slipped from her control, rewritten by the undeniable facts she could no longer bury. Elijah moved forward quietly, no dramatic exit, no triumphant shouts, just a deliberate reclaiming of his space, each step a reaffirmation of his integrity. The anonymous threats and whispers of doubt stopped. He didn't know whether to feel relieved or simply clear. Perhaps both. Weeks passed, then months. The legal and community aftermath was messy, but ultimately just, painful, but survivable. Elijah learned how much of his identity had been wrapped around maintaining a fragile peace, being a silent observer, being a compliant voice. Without that framework, he felt hollow at first. Then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, something else grew in its place, an unshakable sense of purpose. He started his morning runs again, before the city stirred, the rhythm of meditation. He cooked simple, nourishing meals for himself, devoured books on social justice he had put aside, reconnected with genuine community leaders he had slowly drifted from, realizing how isolated he had become in his quiet endurance. One evening, as he sat on his small apartment balcony, watching the sun dip below the skyline, his phone buzzed, a single message. "You did what I couldn't. I hope it brings you peace." Elijah stared at the screen for a long time. He didn't reply. He didn't need to. Some connections existed only to guide you through a storm, not to anchor you to the past. He deleted the message, then set his phone down. For the first time since that fateful night in the community hall, his chest felt light, unburdened. Elijah understood now that betrayal wasn't just about the lies they told, but the truths we allowed ourselves to silence. The small instincts we ignore, the questions we swallow to keep a false peace. He had lost a comfortable illusion, lost the future he thought he was building within a flawed system. But he had gained something far more enduring, his unwavering awareness, and with it, the quiet confidence that no one would ever trap him in the backseat of his own life again. Life didn't suddenly become peaceful after the exposure. It became quieter, which was different, and in many ways harder. In the silence, the echoes of injustice grew louder. Elijah discovered that healing wasn't a straight line, but a series of confrontations with moments he thought he had already processed. A protest song on the radio could unravel an entire afternoon. A familiar community landmark could turn his stomach. Sometimes, he'd reach for his phone out of habit, only to remember there was no one left on the other end who knew him the way he once believed Seraphina had. The systemic unfairness still surfaced in unexpected waves. She had been the architect of the deception, yet she wasn't the one waking up disoriented in a quiet apartment, trying to remember who he had been before the struggle reshaped his routines, his voice, his sense of safety. Elijah had to relearn himself from fragments. Community support helped, though not in the dramatic way movies promised. There were no sudden revelations, just slow, uncomfortable honesty. He learned how often he had minimized his own discomfort to avoid conflict, how he had mistaken complicity for unity, how being understanding had slowly turned into being unheard. One afternoon, weeks after the community's decision was finalized, Elijah ran into Seraphina by accident. It was at a small, independent coffee shop neither of them used to frequent. A neutral place stripped of shared history. She looked different, not broken, but smaller somehow. The formidable confidence that once filled every space around her now sat carefully contained, like something she no longer trusted. They locked eyes for a brief moment, both startled. "Elijah," she said, standing. He nodded. "I didn't expect to see you." Neither of them did. They stood there awkwardly, to people connected by a past that no longer defined them. For a moment, Elijah wondered if this would be the scene he'd imagined late at night, the confrontation, the apologies, the closure. Instead, she spoke first. "I didn't think you'd actually go through with it," she admitted quietly, the words a ghost of her former arrogance, exposing everything. Elijah studied her face. There was no remorse there, just a lingering disbelief. "I didn't either," he said, his voice firm, "until I realized I didn't have a choice." She frowned. "You always had a choice. So did you." The words weren't sharp. They didn't need to be. They sat down. Not together, but near enough to talk. She told him about the fallout, the influence she'd lost. The whispers had grown louder, the community meetings ending not in reassurance, but in weary sighs. "I didn't think freedom would cost this much," Amara murmured, stirring her coffee, though she hadn't added sugar. A flicker of doubt, a shadow of despair, touched her. But it passed. The true cost was only shocking. "When you believed you wouldn't have to pay it." "None of us did," she replied, her gaze sweeping across the faces around her. They looked at her, truly looked, as if searching for the familiar fire. "Do you ever hate them, Amara?" The question hung heavy. Hate required surrender. It required giving them power. "No," she said, her voice firm, "but we will no longer tolerate their silence." That seemed to ignite something deeper than anger. When they parted, there were no promises of easy victories, no dramatic declarations, just a quiet, shared understanding that their paths had already diverged, too far from oppression to ever intersect again. Amara walked home, feeling an unexpected lightness. In the months that followed, she helped build a movement defined not by what they had lost, but by what they now fiercely refused to tolerate. They said no more often, asked questions sooner, trusted their collective instincts, even when it made the powerful uncomfortable. There were moments of profound loneliness. Yes, the burden of leadership, but they were honest moments, not crowded with pretense. One evening, while organizing old community records on her laptop, Amara found a draft petition from decades ago. It was addressed to the city council, written on a night her ancestors had felt especially distant from justice, apologizing for perceived transgressions they hadn't committed, promising to be better citizens. She read it once, then she deleted it, not out of bitterness, but recognition that version of their struggle no longer existed and didn't need to. Amara began leading community outreach, quietly at first, listening to stories that sounded uncomfortably familiar, people who had ignored red flags, who had been told they were imagining things, who had learned too late that peace without justice always comes with conditions. She didn't give advice, she just listened. And sometimes, that was enough. On the anniversary of the night the old town hall was burned, Amara went for a long drive alone. No destination, just motion. As the city lights blurred past, she realized something that surprised her. She wasn't angry at her ancestors anymore. They had done the best they could with the truth they had at the time, and when the truth changed, so did they. That, she decided, was not weakness, it was growth. Amara pulled over at a lookout just before midnight and stepped out into the cool air. The city stretched below her, full of stories intersecting and unraveling all at once. Somewhere out there, people were hiding, planning, loving, betraying, healing. Just as her community had. She breathed deeply. For the first time, the future didn't feel like something waiting to be taken from them. It felt open, and that was enough. Amara didn't rush into rebuilding their community. She let it form slowly, the way muscles strengthen after an injury, not by force, but by consistent, careful movement. Each small decision became an act of trust in themselves, choosing where to build the new community center, how to spend their collective resources, who deserved access to their time. For the first time in generations, their choices weren't shaped by fear of conflict or the need to keep their oppressors comfortable. Still, there were moments when the past reached for them. One afternoon, a certified letter arrived at the community center. Amara recognized the firm's logo instantly. Her hands tightened around the envelope. Before she even opened it, inside was a notice, formal, polite, unavoidable. The city was contesting part of their land claim, claiming misrepresentation, hinting that their activism had been malicious. The old community would have panicked, apologized, questioned themselves. This version of them exhaled slowly and made a phone call. Their legal counsel listened, then said calmly, "This is a pressure tactic. They're trying to see if you'll fold." Amara stared out the window at the street below, people moving freely, unaware of the quiet wars unfolding behind closed doors. "We won't," she said, and they didn't. The challenge dissolved weeks later, quietly withdrawn. No apology followed, none was needed. The silence was confirmation enough. Around that time, Amara began to notice something else, something unexpected. Their community was no longer invisible to itself. They recognized their own reactions now. The tightening in their chests when something felt wrong, the calm when something felt right. They didn't override those signals anymore. That awareness changed how the world responded to them. At city council meetings, they spoke with more certainty, not louder, just clearer. When someone crossed a boundary, they named it. When a policy didn't align with their values, they declined without elaborate explanations. To their surprise, the world didn't collapse. In many cases, it adjusted. One evening, a representative from a neighboring town invited Amara to a small gathering. Nothing formal, just conversation, laughter, no expectations. Amara almost said no, out of habit. Then she caught herself and said yes. That night, sitting on a balcony, surrounded by people who knew nothing about their past struggles, she felt a strange sense of peace. No one expected them to perform. No one needed them to be smaller. They were simply present. Someone asked her casually, What changed for your community this year? Amara thought about it, about the burned hall, the darkness, the voices that tried to silence them. The moment their collective life split in two. We started listening to ourselves, she said. It was the simplest, truest answer. Later, as she walked home alone under streetlights that no longer felt threatening, she realized something profound. Injustice had taught them clarity, but collective healing had taught them discernment. They didn't need to armor themselves against the world. They just needed to stop ignoring what their instincts were trying to protect. Weeks turned into months, months into a year. The shadow of the injustice that once defined him now rested lightly, not forgotten, but no longer a crushing weight. When asked, Elijah spoke his truth, unvarnished, without needing to dramatize when not. He let the silence hold its own. One quiet evening, sifting through forgotten archives of his community's struggle, Elijah found a worn journal. Inside, meticulously penned, were the dreams of his ancestors, blueprints for a future of equality. Journeys they never took, visions of freedom, written in careful, hopeful ink. He turned the pages slowly, and instead of sorrow, he felt a surge of profound gratitude. Not for the outcome, but for the unwavering clarity. Those dreams hadn't failed. They had simply belonged to a chapter of history that had closed, and endings, he realized, were not punishments from the universe. They were sacred permissions to begin anew. Elijah closed the journal, placing it gently aside. He didn't need to erase the past. To honor the vibrant, resilient present, on a sun-drenched Sunday morning, he drove. The windows down, no music, letting his thoughts unfurl like banners in the wind. He smiled, remembering the man he had been. The young man, suffocated by systemic oppression, afraid to breathe, afraid to acknowledge the truth, that man had survived the unimaginable. This man had learned from it, forged by fire, and as the sun climbed higher, painting the windshield with golden light, Elijah felt an unshakable resolve settle deep within him. Not triumph, not vengeance, but an unyielding self-respect. The kind that doesn't demand applause, the kind that doesn't need validation, the kind that ensures you never again accept a life where your voice or the voice of your people is silenced. He drove on, unafraid of what lay ahead. Because whatever came next, he would meet it, fully awake, fully empowered. Elijah thought the hardest part was over. He was wrong. Healing has a way of revealing one final, profound truth. Just when you believe you've reached solid ground, it doesn't rive with chaos or confrontation. It comes quietly, asking you to decide who you are when the chains of the past no longer bind you. The call came on a gray Tuesday afternoon, an unfamiliar number. He almost ignored it. Elijah Vance, a woman's voice asked when he answered. Yes, my name is Aisha Khan. I'm a civil rights advocate. I'm calling regarding a pattern of discrimination your community faced years ago. Something new has surfaced. His stomach tightened, not with fear, but with a chilling recognition. Some stories of injustice don't end cleanly, they wait, Aisha explained carefully. After the public exposure and legal unraveling of a similar case, another community had come forward. Systemic manipulation, economic disenfranchisement, a pattern emerging. Only now that the silence had been broken, you were the first to stand up, Elijah, Aisha said. That matters. After the call ended, Elijah sat motionless at his desk. He wasn't angry. He wasn't scared. He was resolved. He provided what he had, meticulous documents, timelines, records he had preserved instinctively, without knowing why. He didn't embellish, didn't editorialize, just facts. When the investigation expanded, he felt something unexpected, profound relief. Not because justice was guaranteed, but because the burden of truth was no longer resting on his shoulders alone. Weeks later, Aisha called again. You saved more people than you realize, she said, by refusing to stay quiet. That night, Elijah walked through the city longer than usual. The streets pulsed with life. Laughter spilled from vibrant community centers. Elders shared stories on stoops. Strangers passed each other, unaware how close their lives came to intersecting. He realized then that systemic injustice doesn't just damage one individual. It ripples outward, reinforced by silence, enabled by polite indifference. protected by the fear of being labeled troublemakers. And silence, he understood now, was the real accomplice to oppression. Elijah didn't speak publicly about what happened. He didn't need to, but he stopped minimizing it, stopped framing it as just something that happened. It had been something that changed him and his world. One evening, he found himself back at the old community center, the very place where the struggle had begun. Not by accident, but by choice. He parked, stepped out, and stood in the space where he had once stood in the shadows, heart pounding, afraid to move. The air still carried echoes of past struggles, but he wasn't the same man. He closed his eyes and let the memory surface fully. This time, not to relive the pain, but to acknowledge it, the fear, the shock, the moment he understood. His community's future was not what he thought. When he opened his eyes, the space felt smaller, less powerful. Elijah smiled faintly and walked away. Later that night, he wrote something for himself, not a letter of complaint, not an apology, but a declaration of purpose. I will never again confuse peace with silence. I will never again shrink my truth to make injustice comfortable. I will never again ignore the cries of my community to preserve a false harmony. He didn't frame it, didn't share it. He folded the paper and placed it in a drawer. That promise, that sacred vow, was enough. Months later, sitting across from someone new at a bustling cafe, Elijah felt the difference immediately. Not sparks or fantasy, just genuine ease. When he spoke, he wasn't measuring his words. When he listened, he wasn't bracing for manipulation. At one point, she asked him gently, "What led you to become such a fierce advocate?" Elijah didn't hesitate. "I realized our voices were being erased, and I chose to amplify them." She nodded. No judgment, no probing. That was when he knew he was ready, not because the pain was gone, but because it no longer controlled him. As he walked home that night, Elijah thought about the version of himself who hid in the shadows of systemic injustice, believing peace meant silence, believing betrayal was a societal design, not a personal failing. He wished he could reach back to that younger self, not to warn him, not to comfort him, but to promise him this: you will endure. You will rise, and one day, you will thank yourself for listening to the quiet roar of your own spirit when it finally mattered. Because the moment you stop hiding from the truth of your heritage, from the fear of losing a piece that was never truly yours, that's the moment your life truly starts moving forward. And this time, you're not just a passenger, you are the architect of your destiny. Elijah Vance didn't realize the depth of his resolve until the world tested it one last time. The summons arrived without warning, buried between community notices and pleas for calm. At first glance, it looked ordinary, legal jargon, a neutral, almost condescending tone. But the sender's name, the institution that had long sought to silence his people, made his fingers clench. It was from them, not directly, but through their legal counsel. A request for a dialogue, no accusations, no demands. Just a carefully worded appeal to resolve remaining community matters. A year ago, that phrasing would have pulled him back into confusion, hope, even the illusion that justice came from negotiation. Now, he recognized it for what it was, an attempt to reclaim the narrative, to dictate the terms of their liberation. Elijah closed the document and let it sit unanswered for 3 days, a silent act of defiance. When he finally replied, it was brief, polite, firm. He declined. The response came quickly this time. Stripped of its earlier restraint, it accused him of radicalism, of stirring unrest, of turning people against order. The words were sharp, familiar, and strangely ineffective. Elijah read them once, then deleted the message, a digital erasure of their power. The realization was almost startling. Their voice no longer held power over him, not because he had hardened, but because he had clarified who he was without their oppressive interpretation. That night, he slept deeply, dreamless, a peace earned through unwavering conviction. In the weeks that followed, Elijah focused on building rituals that grounded him, organizing community meetings, sharing meals with elders instead of isolating himself, calling his allies more often, not out of obligation, but connection. He discovered that stability wasn't something you found after the fight. It was something you practiced during it, a constant act of collective strength. One evening, As he was leaving a community outreach event he led, a young man approached him quietly. "I heard your story," the man said. "Or pieces of it." Elijah nodded. "Then you know the important parts." The man hesitated. "I'm where you were before everything came out. I don't know if I'm imagining things. If this injustice is real." Elijah studied him for a long moment. He saw the same exhaustion, the same self-doubt, the same fear of being wrong, of being labeled. "You're not here because you're imagining things," Elijah said gently. "You're here because something doesn't feel right in your soul." The man swallowed. "What if I destroy my life by asking questions, by demanding what's ours?" Elijah remembered the silent protests, the threats, the moment of knowing. "What destroys you," he said slowly, "is pretending you don't already know the truth." The man nodded, tears forming, a silent acknowledgement of shared burden, and thanked him before walking away. A spark ignited. Elijah watched him go, aware that some truths can't be given, only recognized. That was the strange, powerful gift of everything he'd been through. He couldn't fight for everyone, but he could remind them they weren't crazy for listening to themselves. One quiet afternoon, Elijah found himself driving through a neighborhood he hadn't visited in years. Streets lined with familiar houses, the old version of his life, complacent, unaware, tucked neatly behind closed doors. He didn't stop. He didn't slow down. He simply passed through, feeling no pull to return to the shadows of his past. At a red light, he caught his reflection in the rearview mirror. There were lines there now, etched by struggle and triumph. Earned ones, not from stress alone, but from profound awareness. He looked steadier, more present, a warrior at peace when the light turned green. He smiled, a genuine, unburdened smile, and kept driving forward. Later that evening, he sat on his porch, the city alive below him, a symphony of resilience. He thought about how easily his story could have ended differently, how close he had come to staying silent, to shrinking, to letting someone else define the ending because he was afraid of the fallout. The injustice of what had been done to his people hadn't disappeared. It didn't need to. Justice, he had learned, wasn't about erasing harm. It was about refusing to carry it forward, refusing to let it define the future. Elijah opened his journal and began writing. Not for an audience, not for validation, but for clarity. He wrote about trust, about manipulation disguised as order, about how people are taught to doubt their instincts in the name of peace. When he finished, he closed the document without saving it. Some truths are meant to be lived, not just published. As the night deepened, Elijah felt a quiet certainty settle in him. His life was no longer organized around avoiding pain or preserving illusions. It was organized around honesty, first with himself, then with the world. He thought again of the young man, hiding in the shadows of doubt, barely breathing, afraid that knowing the truth would destroy him. He wished he could reach back through time and say this. It hurts more than you think to confront the truth, but it also frees you more than you can imagine, because when you stop hiding, when you choose awareness over comfort, integrity over illusion, you don't just survive oppression, you outgrow it, and from that place, nothing can take your life away from you again. Elijah stopped measuring his life by what had been done to him or his people. That shift didn't come with a single realization or a dramatic moment. It arrived quietly, through repetition, through days that were ordinary and honest, through nights where he slept without bracing for betrayal, through conversations that didn't require him to shrink or perform. One evening, while clearing out the last remaining box of old fears and imposed narratives from the dusty archives of the Freedom Quarter Community Center, Elijah Vance unearthed a forgotten ledger, tucked between faded protest banners and brittle legal documents. His grandmother's elegant script adorned its cover. The date, stark and defiant, froze him, the eve of the '68 March for Dignity. Inside, a collection of unsent letters, raw and unfinished, penned by a younger, more hopeful Elijah, a week after the devastating Freedom Fund scandal that rocked their community. They were a fractured plea, a desperate attempt to articulate the betrayal to those who had already turned a deaf ear, their hearts hardened by power. The words screamed desperation, laced with an undeserved apology, brimming with questions that, years later, had found their chilling answers in the systemic cracks of their society. Elijah read, each line a ghost of his past self, not shame, but a profound compassion washed over him. That young man wasn't weak. He was fiercely loyal to a promise of justice. In a world that ruthlessly exploited loyalty, he had trusted not out of naivety, but because integrity and community were the bedrock of his very being. Elijah carefully folded the ledger, not to erase the past, but to honor the truth. That pleading voice no longer defined the man he had become. He placed it back, a relic, not a blueprint. In the months that followed, the struggle continued, testing his resolve in smaller, insidious ways. A city councilman tried to co-opt his community initiatives. A developer pushed aggressive land deals. A new alliance threatened to compromise their core values. Each time, Elijah responded with a newfound steel. He spoke truth to power. He demanded accountability. He slowed the relentless march of progress that left his people behind. He walked away from false promises, from empty gestures, and each time, the world, surprisingly, adjusted. That was the revelation no one ever spoke of. That true solidarity isn't built on silence, but on unwavering principles. What falls apart under the weight of truth was never meant to stand. One late night, after a long, solitary walk through the Freedom Corridor, Elijah stood at the historic Beacon Hill overlook. The city lights shimmered below, a vast, indifferent tapestry. Millions of lives unfolding in parallel, some honest, some hidden, some teetering on the precipice of profound change. He thought about how easily his own story, their community's story, could have ended, broken, bitter, swallowed by the shadows of injustice. How tempting it had been to let the righteous anger define his every breath. But anger, he realized, had an expiration date. What replaced it was a fierce, strategic discernment. He no longer romanticized suffering. He no longer believed justice required endless endurance. Without reciprocity, without action, and most importantly, he no longer mistook the familiar chains of systemic oppression for safety. Months later, Elijah woke with a strange, quiet realization. He hadn't thought about the Freedom Fund scandal in days, not with resentment, not with burning curiosity, not even with the old, familiar sadness. It had become part of their history, not their defining identity. That was when he truly understood that healing isn't about forgetting the wounds of injustice. It's about integrating them into a stronger, more resilient future. The pain doesn't vanish. It loses its power to paralyze. Elijah went about his day with a lightness that surprised him. He organized. He inspired. He made plans for a future forged in equity. Without scanning for inevitable risk, without assuming loss, that evening, he received a message from a young activist he had mentored. A simple, powerful note. I spoke up today. It was terrifying, but I refused to be silenced. Thank you, Elijah. He stared at the screen, a profound stillness settling over him. He didn't reply immediately. Instead, he looked out the window, watching the Freedom Corridor breathe, its spirit rekindled. He thought about how truth, how justice, moves not like an explosion, but like a slow, relentless current, reshaping everything it touches over time. He finally typed back, "You did the hardest part yourself. You listened to your own truth." Because that was the truth. No one had saved them. They had listened. They had chosen clarity. They had stepped out of the shadows. That night, Elijah stood in front of his mirror, a silent vigil. He saw someone older than the young man who once felt lost in the system's labyrinth, steadfast. His eyes no longer searched for permission, but held the unwavering gaze of a leader. He turned off the light and went to bed, not haunted by the past's injustices, not anxious about the future's battles, just present, and somewhere deep in that stillness, the final piece of their story settled into place, not as a dramatic ending, but as a quiet, unshakable certainty. Systemic betrayal didn't define their legacy. Awareness, resilience, and collective action did. And from that point on, nothing built on silence, deception, or injustice would ever have a place in the Freedom Corridor again. Elijah didn't announce their liberation to anyone. He lived it. He learned that was far more powerful. There were no dramatic declarations, no viral social posts reclaiming their narrative, no grand speeches about resilience. Instead, there were choices, quiet, consistent ones that reshaped their days. He chose justice over false harmony, truth over comfortable lies, authentic presence over performative activism, and slowly, the world began to respond. One afternoon, nearly 2 years after the Freedom Fund scandal, Elijah received an invitation he hadn't expected, a summit, small, private, focused on racial equity, systemic reform, and community empowerment. His name had been recommended anonymously. He almost declined. Public spaces that demanded the retelling of past wounds still made him uneasy. But something told him this wasn't about exposure, it was about alignment. When he arrived, there was no spotlight, no grand entrance. Just conversations, thoughtful, raw, people speaking honestly about systemic failures, institutional blind spots, and the devastating cost of ignoring the cries for justice. In these high-stakes environments, for the first time, Elijah realized how universal their community's experience was. Not the specifics of their struggle, but the insidious pattern, trust exploited, dissent silenced, until the quiet erosion of dignity became unbearable. When people are taught to doubt their instincts, to suppress their voices, all in the name of a false, oppressive harmony. During one session, a speaker, a seasoned civil rights advocate, asked a simple, piercing question: what was the moment you knew something was wrong, but chose to look away? The room grew still, heavy with unspoken truths. Elijah felt his chest tighten, the memory of the Freedom Fund betrayal, the darkness, the silencing voices when it was his turn to speak. He didn't share details. He didn't need to. I knew, he said, his voice calm but resonant, when my spirit recoiled before my mind could rationalize it away. And I almost talked myself out of listening to that inner truth. The room nodded, not out of pity, but profound recognition. Later that evening, as people gathered in small, earnest groups, someone approached him, a woman in her 40s, her gaze grounded, direct, and full of shared purpose. Dr. Sharma, a beacon of wisdom, looked at Elijah. I don't know your full story, young man, she said, her voice a gentle current, but I know that fire in your eyes. You didn't just endure, you were forged. I learned to fight, Elijah replied, a quiet strength in his gaze, and I refused to let that lesson be wasted. Dr. Sharma nodded, a knowing smile gracing her lips. They spoke for hours, not dwelling on the scars of the past, but on the bedrock of their shared values, on how clarity, hard-won, reshapes the very foundations of community. How trust, once shattered, must be rebuilt with intention, not blind faith. When the summit for justice concluded, a new dawn broke within Elijah. Elijah walked home, the city lights blurring, feeling an unfamiliar surge, not just relief, but a profound purpose, not a grand, sweeping declaration, but a quiet, burning awareness that his experience, the injustice he faced, wasn't a burden to hide or a wound to endlessly relive. It was a truth to integrate, a story to tell, a beacon to guide his every step. Weeks later, on a calm Sunday morning, Elijah returned to the old town square, the site of his public humiliation. Not out of morbid nostalgia, but out of a fierce need for completion. He stood at the very spot, the air thick with ghosts of memory. The distant murmur of the city was a soft counterpoint to the silence within him. The space, once charged with fear and shame, now felt neutral, reclaimed. He walked to the exact spot where he had once stood, shoulders hunched, dignity stripped, a target of systemic prejudice, afraid to even breathe. But now, he stood tall, unbowed. No anger, no lingering sadness, not even a triumphant roar, only a profound gratitude. Not for the injustice itself, but for the awakening it forced upon him. Elijah closed his eyes, a silent vow passing his lips, then turned and walked away, never looking back. That night, in his small apartment, with the windows open, the city's pulse a rhythmic hum, Elijah reflected on the seismic shift within him. Not external circumstances, but the very core of his being. He no longer sought validation from the very systems that sought to diminish him. He no longer feared setting boundaries, no longer feared losing what was never truly his. Because he understood now, losing what is unjust, what is unsafe, is not a tragedy, it is a correction. As he turned off the lights, preparing for a peaceful sleep, one final, grounding truth settled in his heart. A truth he would carry forward, a torch for others. The moment you stop hiding in the shadows, whether it's from a system, a narrative, or your own silenced voice, is the moment your life stops being something that happens to you and becomes something you consciously, fiercely choose. Elijah slept peacefully, not because injustice had vanished, but because whatever came, he would meet it awake. Elijah woke before dawn the next morning, not from anxiety's grip, but because his spirit had learned a new rhythm. The city outside his window was still, wrapped in that brief, fragile pause before the day's demands. He lay there, listening to the steady beat of his own heart, aware of how profoundly different it felt to wake up, without the familiar dread pressing against his chest. He made coffee, standing by the window as the sky slowly bled from inky black to hopeful blue. There was a time when mornings like this were filled with questions. What new challenge would the system pose? What version of justice would he be denied today? What piece of his identity would he have to surrender to keep the peace? Now, the silence belonged to him. That difference, that reclamation, mattered more than he could have imagined. Later that day, Elijah met with Dr. Sharma one final time. The paperwork was routine. Signatures, confirmations, the official closing of a chapter that had once threatened to consume his very soul. As he signed the last document, he felt no surge of triumphant elation, no lingering sorrow, only a steady, profound sense of completion. "You handled this with remarkable grace, Elijah," Dr. Sharma said, her smile warm. "Most people don't." Elijah nodded. "I didn't, at first." He walked out of the building and into the afternoon sun, realizing that for the first time since the injustice, there was nothing left to resolve, no loose ends waiting to pull him backward, no haunting echoes of what was lost, only forward motion. In the weeks that followed, Elijah began to notice how people responded differently to him, not because they knew his story, but because he no longer negotiated his presence. He spoke with quiet certainty, his voice resonating with truth. He listened, truly present. He didn't over-explain or apologize for existing. That shift drew the right people closer and filtered out the rest. One evening, he received a message from someone he hadn't heard from in years. An old friend, lost to the shadows of his struggle. They met for dinner, catching up cautiously at first, then with an open heart. "You seem solid," his friend said, a genuine warmth in his eyes, different, but in a powerful way. Elijah smiled. "I stopped pretending the system was okay when it wasn't." His friend nodded. "That'll do it." As the night deepened, Elijah realized how much he had missed simple, honest connection. Not intensity, not drama, just being seen, truly seen, without performance. It reminded him that healing wasn't about isolation. It was about discerning who belonged in his journey. There were still moments when the past surfaced, unexpectedly, a song, a scent, a phrase that echoed the injustice. But those moments no longer dragged him under. They passed through him like weather, acknowledged, then released. One afternoon, while cleaning his apartment, Elijah found an old, tarnished badge, a relic from the night everything unraveled. He held it in his palm for a long moment, feeling the cold weight of what it once represented. Then he placed it in a box, not as a rejection of his history, but as a quiet acknowledgement that he no longer needed reminders of who he was to move forward. That evening, Elijah took a long walk through the city. People passed him, some laughing, some tense, some lost in their own private struggles. He didn't judge them. He recognized them. Everyone carried something unseen. As he crossed a bridge, he stopped at the center and looked down at the river, moving steadily below. It reminded him of how truth works. Not loud, not rushed, but relentless. It finds its way through every crack, reshaping even the strongest structures over time. Vance understood now that the most insidious lies weren't the ones whispered by oppressors, but the ones he told himself to survive. That silence was protection, that compliance was peace, that his voice was too small to matter. These beliefs had shackled him far longer than any external force ever could. Releasing them was the true liberation. As the sun dipped, painting the Foundry district in hues of defiant gold, Elias felt a profound shift within him. Not closure, not forgiveness, but acceptance. He accepted that he had been betrayed by a system designed to diminish. He accepted that he had ignored his instincts for justice longer than he should have. He accepted that none of it made him weak. It made him human, and humans, he had learned, were capable of extraordinary clarity and courage. Once they stopped running from the truth, Elias turned, his stride purposeful, blending back into the vibrant rhythm of the city. His story no longer needed to be dramatic to be meaningful. It had already done its work, reshaping how he moved, how he trusted, how he chose. The night he had felt compelled to hide, to shrink, had taken something from him. But everything that followed had given him something far greater. His life, fully his, this time, was finally in motion, a force for change. Elias began to notice that the hardest moments no longer came from memories of past injustices, but from moments of unexpected peace. It startled him how unfamiliar calm could feel. There were afternoons when nothing went wrong. No tension, no hidden meanings, no emotional labor required, and his body would still brace, waiting for impact. He'd catch himself scanning conversations for danger, searching faces for subtle shifts, listening for the old signals that once meant survival. When that happened, he didn't shame himself. He paused, breathed, reminded himself that hypervigilance was a scar of systemic struggle, not a flaw. Healing, he learned, wasn't about proving strength. It was about allowing softness and vulnerability without fear. One evening, as rain streaked down his windows, Elias cooked dinner slowly, deliberately. No distractions, no phone nearby. He moved through the kitchen with ease, realizing that he used to rush everything: meals, conversations, decisions, afraid that slowing down would invite conflict or expose weakness. Now, slowness felt safe as he ate. He thought about how his old life had been built around anticipation, anticipating the system's moods, its reactions, its approval. He had confused attentiveness with submission, vigilance with devotion. It had taken losing everything to see the difference. After dinner, he sat with a notebook, not to analyze the past, but to imagine the future. Not in grand plans or rigid goals, but in values. He wrote words like honesty, steadfastness, reciprocity, courage. He didn't write love not yet because love, he understood now, was not something you chased or endured. It was something that emerged naturally when you stopped betraying yourself and your community. Days later, Elias received a message from someone he had met at a community forum months earlier. A simple invitation for coffee. No pressure, no expectations. He agreed. They met at a quiet cafe, sunlight filtering through wide windows, illuminating a mural of civil rights heroes. The conversation flowed easily, not because it was perfect, but because it was unforced, authentic. They spoke about their work, about books, about how people change after life disrupts them. At one point, she said, "You seem comfortable being alone." Elias considered that. "I learned to be," he replied, not as a defense, but as a foundation. She smiled. That's rare. He didn't mistake her interest for destiny. He didn't project meaning where there was none. He simply enjoyed the moment for what it was. Connection without urgency. When they parted, there was no promise of more, and yet, no sense of loss. That, too, was new. As weeks passed, Elias felt increasingly anchored in himself. His days were full, but not crowded. Purposeful, but not rigid. He had space to think, to feel, to respond instead of react. And occasionally, when he least expected it, gratitude surfaced. Gratitude for the version of himself who hadn't looked away that night, who had stayed silent long enough to listen to the whispers of injustice, who had chosen truth over comfort, even when the cost was terrifying. He understood now that the moment of shock, the betrayal, the injustice, the unraveling, had not been the end of his life. It had been the interruption he needed to truly begin. One night, while walking home under a sky heavy with clouds, Elias passed a parked car with its engine off. Lights dim, interior barely visible. For a split second, the image froze him in place, a ghost of past fear. Then he smiled, not because it didn't matter, but because it no longer owned him. He kept walking. At home, he turned off the lights and stood by the window, watching the Foundry District pulse softly below. Thousands of lives unfolding at once. Some filled with honesty, others quietly breaking, many hovering at the edge of realization, not knowing yet that their lives were about to change. Elias hoped, quietly, without urgency, that when those moments came, they would listen. Because the truth, once seen, does not destroy you, it reorganizes you. It strips away what was never stable, and leaves you standing in something real, something earned. As he prepared for bed, Elias reflected on the arc of his story, not as a victim's journey, not as a triumph over an enemy, but as an awakening, a shift from living defensively to living deliberately, for himself and for a more just world. He no longer needed an ending that felt dramatic or vindicating. The real resolution was this: he trusted himself, and that trust shaped every choice that followed. Elias lay down, the city humming beyond the walls, and closed his eyes, not retreating from the world, but resting within it, ready for whatever came next. Time kept moving, and for once, Elias moved with it, instead of chasing or resisting it. There were days when nothing significant happened, no revelations, no emotional milestones, just the steady beat of a life fully lived. No grand, symbolic gestures marked those days. Yet, Elijah realized they were quietly, profoundly extraordinary. They were the undeniable proof that his spirit was no longer defined by the crisis. He had once endured normality, once a dull hum, had become a sacred symphony. One sun-drenched Saturday, Elijah visited his elders. He hadn't been avoiding them, but the weight of his past battles had often kept him from being truly present. Every visit, in the darkest years, had been filtered through the exhaustion of fighting for what was right and the distraction of systemic injustice. Now, he sat at the kitchen table, sipping coffee strong enough to wake the ancestors, listening to his grandfather lament the crumbling community fence, and his grandmother speak of a neighbor's new hope. At one point, his grandmother studied him, her eyes deep with wisdom. "You look lighter, son," she said, a knowing smile gracing her lips. Elijah smiled back, a genuine, unburdened smile. "I feel lighter, Grandma." She didn't press for details. She didn't need to. Elders, he realized, often sense the deepest truths long before their children are ready to voice them. Later, as he drove home, the city lights a soft glow against the twilight. He reflected on how much of his life had once been spent managing perceptions, making sure things looked fine, even when the very foundations of justice were crumbling around him. That habit of self-silencing had been a hard one to unlearn. Sometimes, he still caught himself instinctively minimizing the discomfort of injustice, brushing past awkward truths, choosing silence over the searing honesty he now craved. But now, when he noticed it, he corrected course, swiftly, decisively. That was the profound difference. One charged afternoon, at the corporate headquarters, a senior executive proposed a new policy that felt inherently wrong, ethically questionable, legally ambiguous. It reeked of systemic bias. In the past, Elijah would have hesitated, paralyzed by the fear of consequences, of being labeled difficult or radical. He would have swallowed the bitter discomfort, telling himself it wasn't his battle to fight. This time, he spoke. His voice, though calm, cut through the hushed tension. "I am not comfortable with this," he stated, his gaze unwavering, "and I will not be part of it." The opulent room went utterly silent. A few people exchanged nervous glances. Someone sighed, a breath held too long. Then, unexpectedly, another voice, hesitant at first, joined his. "I was thinking the same thing," a colleague admitted, her eyes meeting Elijah's with newfound courage. "I just didn't know how to say it." The policy was revised. The suffocating tension eased. Afterward, as Elijah walked back to his desk, he felt a subtle, powerful surge of pride, not in being right, but in being aligned with his deepest convictions. He understood now how silence spreads, like a creeping shadow, and how courage, even the quietest whisper of it, can ignite a wildfire. That evening, as he left the towering office building, his phone buzzed. It was a message from the woman he'd met for coffee weeks earlier, a fellow advocate for change. "I enjoyed our conversation. Would you like to walk sometime?" No pressure. Elijah read it twice, noticing how his body responded. No tightness, no rush. No anxiety, just an expansive openness. He replied, yes. They met a few days later at a riverside path, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of defiance and hope. They walked side by side, sometimes talking, sometimes comfortable in the profound silence of shared understanding. When she laughed, it was unguarded, a melody of freedom. When she listened, it was attentive, without expectation, without judgment. At one point, she turned to him, her eyes reflecting the fading light. Do you believe people can really change? Elijah looked at the swirling water, thinking deeply. I think people can wake up, he said, his voice resonant. Change is what happens after that, if they're willing to do the work, to confront the truth. She nodded, as if that answer held the weight of generations. They didn't label anything. They didn't make promises. And when they parted, Elijah felt something he hadn't felt in a long, long time. Curiosity. Not desperation, not attachment, just a profound curiosity about what might grow if given space, if nurtured with truth. That night, alone in his apartment, Elijah reflected on how profoundly different this felt from his past. He wasn't trying to prove his worth to a system that denied it. He wasn't auditioning for love or acceptance. He wasn't ignoring warning signs in the hope that sheer effort would compensate for fundamental incompatibilities, for systemic flaws. He was simply present, fully, authentically. As he prepared for bed, he caught sight of himself in the mirror again. The man staring back looked calm, not because life was suddenly perfect, but because he trusted his ability to navigate imperfection, to stand firm against injustice. That trust had been hard-earned, forged in fire. Elijah thought again of the night. Everything changed, the suffocating darkness of the car, the betrayal of ideals unfolding in real time, the shock that had cracked his life wide open. For so long, he had seen that moment as a gaping wound. Now, he saw it as a sacred threshold. Crossing it had cost him a comfortable illusion, a future he thought was secure, a version of himself built on self-denial and complicity. But it had given him something far more durable, far more precious: discernment, unshakable integrity, and the courage to listen when something felt profoundly wrong. He lay down, lights off, the city breathing softly outside. Tomorrow would be another ordinary day, and that, finally, felt like enough. Sometimes, the most painful moments in life aren't meant to destroy us. They're meant to wake us up, to ignite the fire of change within. This story isn't really about personal betrayal. It's about the quiet instincts we ignore, the urgent questions we silence, and the devastating price we pay when we choose comfort over truth, when we choose complicity over justice. Real strength isn't staying and enduring what slowly erases your spirit, what slowly diminishes your dignity. Real strength is listening when something feels wrong, even when walking away from the familiar costs you everything you thought you wanted, everything you thought you needed. Healing doesn't mean forgetting the pain. It means learning from it, learning to trust yourself again, to reclaim your voice, to set boundaries without guilt, and to believe that peace is not something you earn through suffering. It's something you choose through honesty, through courage, through unwavering integrity. If this story resonated with you, if it stirred something deep within, share your thoughts in the comments. What part hit closest to home for you? And if you believe stories like this matter, if you believe in the power of truth and resilience, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us keep sharing powerful, real-life stories that remind us we're not alone in this fight, and that it's never, ever too late to choose yourself, to choose justice, to choose freedom.